Welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you so much for joining us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and paying our hardworking team. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment, so we can keep bringing these universes to life for you. The Abyssal Vanguard Academy hung suspended over the absolute void of Gargantua, a station built on the very edge of an event horizon. Inside the grand admission chamber, three cosmic sovereigns stared down at a tiny, fragile creature. Emmanuel Bunch, the first and only human cadet in history, stood bleeding under the crushing atmospheric pressure. Along her spine and temples, thick biosuppressor pins pulsed with an angry red light. The cold, sterile light of the room cast long shadows over the Council of Three. To the left hovered an ethereal, a towering pillar of pure, undulating quantum energy that possessed no physical form. In the absolute center loomed a Drogor, a colossal, armored behemoth whose dense biology naturally manipulated the local gravity field with every single breath. To the right sat a sylph, a hauntingly beautiful entity composed of shifting, razor-sharp biocrystalline lattices. They were the absolute pinnacle of cosmic evolution. They were the wardens of the abyss, and they were furious. Emmanuel slowly pushed the glowing data slate back across the dark obsidian table. She was officially refusing the most fundamental law of the Academy. I will not sign the pledge for physical and mental synchronization in group training, Emmanuel said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the primal terror they usually extracted from lesser species. The Drogor leaned forward. The shift in his immense mass caused the gravity in the chamber to spike, pressing heavily against Emmanuel's shoulders and forcing her knees to tremble. "Your species is a fragile anomaly, human," the Drogor rumbled, the sheer acoustic force vibrating through the reinforced metal deck. "You are entirely arrogant. You are physically weak. You are a selfish breed. Humanity crawls out of its dirt cradle and dares to reject the cosmic symbiosis that holds this vanguard together. You do not understand what it takes to fight the cosmic anomalies lurking beyond the light." Emmanuel did not flinch beneath the crushing weight. She simply offered a calm, exhausted smile. It was the kind of smile worn by apex predators right before they stopped playing with their prey. "I do not refuse out of arrogance, Councilman," Emmanuel replied softly. She raised a bruised hand and tapped one of the heavy metallic pins driven deep into her right temple. "I refuse, because if I sign that document and unlock my mental synchronization, your brains will explode into pieces within 3 seconds." The chamber fell dead silent. The ethereal flared with blinding white indignation, while the sylph's crystalline ridges chimed in chaotic, razor-sharp frequencies of pure offense. To threaten the minds of the Admission Council was not just insubordination, it was absolute heresy. "You dare speak of our neural networks as inferior?" the ethereal hissed, its voice echoing as a telepathic strike directly inside Emmanuel's skull. "We, who navigate the astral tides and bind the galaxy together?" "I state a biological and mathematical fact," Emmanuel maintained, her tone cold and unwavering. "My suppressors stay locked into my flesh. I train alone." The Drogor slammed a massive fist down, fracturing the obsidian table. "Then, you shall prove this absurd claim, human. You will be subjected to the most catastrophic survival protocols this Academy possesses. You will face the crucible without the safety of the synchronized network. If you fail, or if you break, you will be expelled directly into the void, and humanity will be permanently erased from the Alliance registry." Emmanuel lowered her head in a slow, mock bow. "Set up the arenas," she said. The gravity decompression chamber was a masterpiece of quantum engineering, a massive spherical void designed to replicate the spatial fracturing found within the belly of a black hole. High above the testing floor, behind a viewport of neutron-forged glass, the three council members took their observation positions. In the entire history of the Abyssal Vanguard Academy, the absolute physical limit achieved by the most robust alien cadets was an endurance run at 30 Gs for exactly 1 hour. Anything beyond that shattered their exoskeletons and liquefied their internal organs. The heavy blast doors hissed open, and Emmanuel stepped into the stark, glaring light of the testing floor. She was expected to wear the standard hyperfluid protective suit, a thick layer of programmable matter designed to distribute kinetic stress and preserve the structural integrity of the wearer. Instead, she wore nothing but her standard-issue canvas fatigues, the red lights of the biosuppressor pins along her spine bleeding through the thin fabric. She stood exactly in the dead center of the chamber, looking incredibly small against the vast, geometric walls of the simulator. "Cadet Bunch," the automated voice of the artificial intelligence echoed through the metallic cavern. "Please equip your zero-point safety gear before the commencement of the trial." Emmanuel tilted her neck, a sharp cracking sound echoing upward into the observation deck. "Override protocol," she commanded, her voice steady and echoing against the cold steel. "Disengage all safety dampeners. Access the manual overwrite and initiate Earth warm-up mode." Up in the observation deck, the ethereal rippled in confusion. The system was designed to cap at 50 Gs, but Emmanuel had tapped into the root access of the mainframe. The artificial intelligence chimed a series of rapid, dissonant tones. The chamber did not just increase the gravity. It violently tore the fundamental laws of physics to shreds. The atmospheric pressure instantly slammed down at 100 Gs. The air itself turned into a solid block of invisible concrete. The floor beneath Emmanuel's boots instantly buckled, the reinforced titanium alloy shattering like cheap porcelain. At 100 times the force of standard gravity, a human heart should instantly collapse, and the blood should turn into a crushing sludge. But the trial did not stop there. Exactly 1 second later, the gravity completely inverted, ripping upward to -80 Gs. This was not merely a weight test. The continuous, randomized oscillation between extreme positive and extreme negative gravity created localized quantum shear waves. The environment fractured into literal spatial blades, invisible kinetic guillotines that violently pulled and pushed matter simultaneously. Through the observation glass, the council watched in stunned silence. The sheer acoustic violence of the chamber was horrifying. Emmanuel's bones emitted a sickening, rhythmic cracking noise, like a dying forest snapping in a hurricane. Tiny, microscopic blood vessels beneath her pale skin ruptured, painting her arms and neck in blooming patches of deep purple and violent red. Blood began to freely leak from her nose and the corners of her eyes, streaking down her jawline as the gravity tried to tear her flesh from her skeleton. She should have been a red mist on the floor, but she did not fall. Slowly, defying the crushing weight of 100 Gs and the ripping force of -80, Emmanuel shifted her stance. She lowered her center of gravity, ignoring the spatial blades grazing her uniform, and threw a punch. Then, she threw another. She began to execute a series of lethal, close-quarters combat routines. Every movement was a precise, calculated strike designed for maximum slaughter. Despite the catastrophic forces fighting against her every muscle fiber, her speed continuously increased. The council watched, paralyzed, as her fists and kicks moved so rapidly they began to generate visual afterimages. She was fighting the gravity, slicing through the kinetic waves with pure, unadulterated physical violence. The blood, flying from her knuckles, hung in the air for a fraction of 1 second before being slammed into the floor, or violently thrown into the ceiling by the shifting gravity fields. Suddenly, a blinding warning light bathed the chamber in crimson. The violent, unnatural fluctuation of the gravity was tearing the chamber apart from the inside. The primary energy core, a contained sphere of volatile plasma suspended in a magnetic cradle, at the back of the room, began to groan. The quantum tethers holding the plasma were snapping under the strain of the randomized gravity waves. "Core containment failure imminent," the artificial intelligence blared. "Catastrophic overload in 10 seconds." The Drogor slammed his armored hands against the glass. The explosion of the primary core would not just vaporize the chamber. It would shatter the neutron-forged glass and incinerate the observation deck, erasing the Council from existence. There was no time to deploy the emergency shields. There was no time to run. Down on the floor, the gravity spiked one final time. Instead of sprinting toward the heavily armored exit doors to save herself, Emmanuel pivoted. She launched herself directly into the heart of the collapsing magnetic cradle. The plasma core was a blinding, roaring sun of untamed energy, expanding rapidly as the containment field died. Emmanuel reached out with her bare, bleeding hands. She did not use a force field. She did not use advanced alien telekinesis. She clamped her fingers directly onto the superheated, destabilizing containment rings. The flesh on her palms hissed, searing instantly as the raw thermal energy kissed her skin. Using nothing but pure, terrifying physical compressive force, she squeezed. The muscles in her back expanded, the canvas of her shirt tearing as she forced the magnetic rings back into alignment. She crushed the expanding plasma core inward, forcing the volatile energy to choke on its own mass. With a final, agonizing metallic scream, the core submitted. The blinding light faded into a dull, safe blue hum, and the gravity in the chamber instantly zeroed out. The sudden silence was deafening. The heavy blast doors hissed open. Emmanuel slowly walked out of the chamber. Her uniform was torn to shreds, her skin bruised and burned, and her hands were charred and bleeding freely onto the pristine deck of the hallway. She paused right below the observation window, looking up at the terrified faces of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. She raised the back of her burned hand, casually wiped the thick stream of blood from the corner of her mouth, and looked directly into the eyes of the Drogor. "That was just our stretching routine," she said. The mental arena was formerly known as the interference cage. It was a stark departure from physical torment, serving strictly as a descent into absolute psychological deterioration. The cage was an isolated sensory deprivation vault, bathed in raw, unfiltered radiation frequencies, harvested directly from the darkest sectors of the abyss. These invisible waves bypassed physical matter entirely, clawing directly at the consciousness and sanity of anyone locked inside. To establish a baseline of the sheer terror within, one only needed to look at the ethereals. Even as the undisputed psychic masters of the known galaxy, capable of linking star systems with their minds, the greatest of their kind could endure the cage for a maximum of 2 hours. Past that exact mark, their luminous forms would shatter into catastrophic paranoia and permanent ego death. Emmanuel walked into the suffocating darkness of the vault. The atmosphere was incredibly cold, thick with the phantom whispers of 1,000 dying stars. She turned back toward the heavy, reinforced threshold, looking directly up at the glowing optical lenses of the surveillance matrix. "Lock the primary hatch," she instructed, her voice cutting through the unnatural silence. "Engage the heavy deadbolts and seal the operational system with an independent, analog cipher. I want physical locks. Do not open this door from the outside under any circumstances until the testing cycle is complete." The heavy blast doors sealed shut with a deafening metallic thud, plunging her into pitch-black isolation. Emmanuel stood perfectly still for one moment. Then, she raised her right hand. Her bruised fingers closed tightly around the thick, metallic biosuppressor pin embedded deep into the flesh of her left temple. She did not hesitate. With a sickening crunch of bone and a wet tearing of tissue, she violently snapped the suppression lock right out of her skull. The reaction within the Academy was absolutely instantaneous. Every single cognitive scanner across the entire Vanguard orbital station erupted into blinding red klaxons. The emergency sirens shrieked a deafening warning, but it was not because the abyssal radiation was consuming the mind of the human cadet. It was because something impossibly ancient and unfathomably dark was violently pushing back. Emmanuel's unprotected consciousness did not buckle under the crushing weight of the cosmic horror. Instead, it rapidly uncoiled. A psychic frequency of pure, unfiltered nightmare began to radiate outward from her small frame. It was a wave so dense, so heavy, and so hostile that it completely overpowered the abyssal radiation. The cosmic static of the black hole was drowned out by a roaring, suffocating tide of human will. Up in the secure command center, the monitors meant to simply display her brainwave activity, warped into terrifying, visceral, holographic projections. The instructors recoiled in absolute horror, physically shielding their eyes as the screens vomited forth the unfiltered genetic memory of the human race. They did not see the pristine, calculated evolution of the higher alien species. They were forced to witness millions of years of unadulterated, desperate slaughter. The holographic projectors flooded the room with phantom oceans of boiling blood. The Council saw visions of devastating viral plagues rotting the flesh from living bone. They felt the blinding, skin-melting flashes of nuclear warfare igniting the atmosphere of a dying blue planet. They witnessed the agonizing, savage brutality of primitive survival in freezing mud, the cold logic of trench warfare, and the endless cycles of predators hunting in the dark. The human subconscious was not a delicate, organized garden of rational thought. It was a mass grave. It was a feral, starving apex beast built from eons of shared planetary trauma. And right now, that beast was aggressively chewing up the ethereal darkness of the abyss and swallowing it whole. Below the command deck, the situation rapidly spiraled completely out of control. The Academy's massive quantum processing cores began to physically catch fire. Plumes of thick, acrid smoke poured from the server banks. The hyper-advanced machinery was violently overheating, entirely incapable of rendering or processing the sheer volume of psychological atrocities pouring out of one single human mind. The psychic containment fields of the cage shattered. Emmanuel's mental shockwaves leaked directly into the surrounding corridors. Alien cadets of various formidable species collapsed instantly to the metal deck. They convulsed and violently passed out, their nervous systems completely short-circuiting just from catching a microscopic fraction of the human psychic echo. The ambient telepathic backlash was causing immediate, systemic hemorrhaging among the telepathic breeds. "Cut the main power grid," the Ethereal Council member commanded, its usually stable luminous form flickering wildly in genuine, unprecedented terror. "Sever the connection immediately before she lobotomizes the entire sector." The entire testing wing went completely dark as the massive mechanical breaker switches were violently pulled. In the suffocating, heavy silence that followed the shutdown, a chilling revelation permanently settled over the Council. They had fundamentally and entirely misunderstood the human condition. Humanity did not manage to survive the vast, terrifying emptiness of the universe because they possessed some kind of stoic immunity to cosmic madness. They survived because a brutal, incomprehensible madness had been painstakingly encoded into their very DNA as a primary instinct. The universe was a dark, terrifying place, so humanity had evolved by becoming the darkest, most terrifying monster in the room. The abyss had tried to stare into the human mind, and the human mind had simply smiled back with jagged, bloody teeth. The command hierarchy of the Vanguard Academy refused to concede defeat. Driven to a breaking point by her previous displays of raw defiance, the Council mandated one final, absolute condition. Emmanuel would lead a 4-person squad into a maximum-level tactical simulation. The objective was straightforward. They needed to infiltrate the rotting hull of an ancient, derelict dreadnought, adrift in hostile space, and extract its main memory core. She was forced into the role of squad captain. Her fire team consisted of 3 alien cadets. There was a hulking Drogor heavy breacher, who scoffed at her lack of physical armor, a highly suspicious ethereal scout who deeply doubted her cognitive processing speeds, and a structurally fragile sylph technician who trembled at the thought of frontline combat. The alien observers expected Emmanuel to fail miserably at leadership. They anticipated a reckless, selfish display of brute force that would inevitably get her team theoretically killed. Instead, she orchestrated an absolute masterclass in modern kinetic warfare. From the second their boots hit the simulated deck, Emmanuel did not operate as a lone wolf. She became a silent, razor-sharp tactical conductor. She took the vanguard position, placing her unarmored biological body right at the most dangerous point of contact. When the simulated automated defense turrets locked onto their signatures, she did not simply try to destroy them alone. She perfectly utilized her team. "Drogor, invert the local gravity on that upper bulkhead," Emmanuel commanded, her voice cutting through the communications link with absolute, chilling authority. "Sylph, you have exactly 3 seconds to slice the optic lines while it is distracted. Ethereal, blanket our thermal signatures immediately." The execution was flawless. Emmanuel commanded the flow of the firefight, physically throwing herself into the line of simulated plasma fire to shield the fragile sylph. She utilized the Drogor's immense bulk as a mobile kinetic wall, guiding him to optimal structural choke points. She synchronized with the ethereal's psychic mapping, shooting blind through solid titanium walls to eliminate targets a fraction of 1 second before they could fully materialize. The alien cadets, initially resentful and arrogant, rapidly fell into line. They felt an unexpected, overwhelming sense of security operating behind the tiny human. Up in the safety of the observation deck, the Council breathed a collective sigh of relief. The human had finally integrated. The human was capable of cosmic symbiosis. Then, the simulation completely broke. Just as Emmanuel's heavily armored Drogor breached the final vault to secure the data core, the pristine holographic blue interface of the environment violently shattered. The lighting abruptly shifted, bathing the rotting metal corridors in a suffocating, visceral blood red. The digital countdown timers above the extraction doors scrambled into unrecognizable, jagged symbols before the heavy blast shields slammed shut, physically welding themselves together. The simulated communication lines to the Academy observation deck screamed with a burst of deafening static and died instantly. This was no longer a structured test. The digital architecture of the Academy had been compromised from the outside. A true abyssal entity had breached the orbital firewall. It was a genuine cosmic parasite, a reality-eating demon from the deepest, darkest trenches of the black hole, drawn like a moth to the massive energy signatures of the Academy's supercomputers. It had hijacked the simulation, turning the virtual dreadnought into a physical, locked cage. It was a hunting trap, and the 4 cadets were the prime prey. The air temperature dropped to absolute zero. The shadows in the corner of the vault began to physically detach from the walls, coalescing into a towering, multi-dimensional mass of grinding jaws, dead eyes, and shifting, impossible geometries. The mere presence of the entity weaponized the surrounding atmosphere. The psychic and physical pressure was immediate and catastrophic. The ethereal cadet shrieked, its luminous body violently dimming into a sickly, dying gray as its mind was instantly crushed by the cosmic despair. The Drogor, a species bred to withstand immense planetary crushing forces, violently collapsed to its knees. The giant coughed up dark, viscous blood as the entity manipulated the localized physics to effortlessly snap its massive femurs. The fragile sylph hit the floor, its biocrystalline body cracking into thousands of spiderweb fractures, utterly paralyzed by the raw, radiating terror of the apex predator. In less than 2 seconds, the 3 elite alien cadets were completely incapacitated, lying in the freezing dark, waiting for an inevitable, agonizing death. Emmanuel, stood alone in the center of the bleeding room. She looked at her fallen squadmates, and then she looked slowly up at the towering, shifting mass of the abyssal horror. She did not reach for her sidearm. She did not attempt to trigger an emergency evacuation beacon. Instead, she reached behind her neck. Her fingers curled around the heavy, interlocking metallic latches of the remaining biosuppressor pins, bolted directly into her spinal column. With a series of sharp, heavy mechanical clicks, she unfastened all of them. The thick metal components fell away, clattering violently against the steel floor. A terrifying, boiling heat began to radiate from her small human frame. Blood wept from her torn knuckles and her exhausted eyes. But she looked up at the nightmare of the cosmos and smiled. It was a wide, unhinged, deeply horrifying smile. "Finally," Emmanuel whispered, wiping the fresh blood across her cheek. "A chance to do some serious training." "Close your visual receptors immediately," Emmanuel commanded, her voice no longer sounding like the composed cadet they had known, but rather a resonant, distorted growl that vibrated directly through the blood-soaked decking of the simulation chamber. "Curl your bodies into the absolute tightest defensive spheres you can manage. Do not look at me. Do not try to assist me under any circumstances. If you open your eyes now, the ambient kinetic radiation will permanently blind you." The three broken aliens, shivering in the freezing shadow of the cosmic horror, obeyed without a single question or moment of hesitation. They pressed their faces into the cold floor, completely surrendering to their paralyzing dread, bracing for their inevitable slaughter. They did not understand that their squad captain was not preparing to die. She was preparing to initiate chaos release, the true, heavily classified standard of human martial conditioning. The moment the final metallic suppressor pin struck the steel floor, the artificial atmosphere of the locked simulation chamber violently collapsed. Emmanuel's body underwent a catastrophic, forced evolutionary overclocking. It was a biological failsafe, a horrific genetic sequence buried deep within the human genome, designed specifically to violently burn the candle of life from both ends when faced with absolute extinction. Her irises flared, igniting into a blinding, predatory amber light that pierced the absolute darkness of the room like twin dying suns. Beneath her ruined canvas uniform, her muscle fibers began to violently snap, tear, and instantaneously regenerate at an impossible, sickening speed. The acoustic horror of her flesh ripping and healing sounded like thick, wet cables, snapping under immense tension. The metabolic heat generated by this relentless cycle of micro-destruction and hyper-reconstruction was so intense that the surrounding air literally boiled. It created dense, localized shockwaves that visibly bent the light around her small frame, warping the visual space into a hazy mirage of pure heat. She was no longer just flesh and bone. She had transformed into a walking, detonating biological warhead. The abyssal entity lunged, projecting a massive, suffocating wave of reality, warping dark matter, meant to erase her physical form from the fundamental fabric of existence. It was entirely too slow. Emmanuel simply vanished. She did not utilize teleportation or quantum displacement. She simply moved with a pure, kinetic ferocity that completely bypassed the visual processing capabilities of the physical universe. A deafening sonic boom shattered the remaining digital infrastructure of the room, raining sparks and shattered glass over the cowering alien cadets. Emmanuel reappeared suspended directly above the towering monstrosity. With her bare, bleeding hands, she grabbed the outer layer of its supposedly invulnerable, dimensional energy membrane. Gripping the invisible cosmic fabric, she relied on pure, unadulterated physical force and violently ripped it open. The sound of the entity's shield breaking was like 1,000 sheets of solid titanium being torn apart simultaneously. Emmanuel descended upon the creature like a meteor, unleashing a barrage of strikes so devastatingly fast and overwhelmingly heavy that each individual impact generated a blinding flash of atmospheric ignition. She was beating a god of the void to death with her bare knuckles. The entity shrieked in absolute confusion, emitting a frequency that would normally shatter the sanity of a lesser star system. Desperate and thrashing, the nightmare whipped a massive, serrated spatial tentacle around Emmanuel's left arm, trapping her in a vice of dark gravity and crushing the limb with the concentrated force of a collapsing star. A normal biological organism would have immediately succumbed to the systemic shock of having its appendage pulverized. Emmanuel simply let out a breathless, blood-chilling laugh. With a savage, unhesitating twist of her entire torso, she intentionally snapped her own trapped arm completely backward, tearing her own muscles and tendons to free herself from the trap. As the bone broke cleanly through her bruised skin, she did not scream in agony. Instead, she gripped the protruding, jagged edge of her own shattered radius bone with her right hand, violently ripping it the rest of the way out of her bleeding forearm to use as a makeshift, calcium-forged dagger. Propelled by the sheer momentum of her self-mutilation, she drove her own splintered, bloody bone directly into the creature's central, pulsing energy core. For the first time in its infinite dark existence, the entity from the abyss felt a fundamentally impossible emotion. It felt genuine, paralyzing terror. The apex predator of the cosmos looked down at the tiny, fragile organic being that was currently drenched in her own blood, laughing maniacally as she waged a war of ultimate violence through absolute, agonizing pain. The cosmic parasite realized, far too late, that it had walked into a locked cage with something infinitely worse than itself. Emmanuel violently twisted the bone dagger deep inside the creature's chest. She did not offer mercy. She ignited the remaining absolute limit of her biocellular reserves, channeling the totality of her biological energy into one single, cataclysmic physical release. The impact triggered a localized kinetic explosion that hit with the concussive force of a low-yield thermonuclear warhead. The sheer pressure rushed outward from her fist, completely crushing the entity from the inside out. The blast atomized its dark matter cells, rapidly degenerating the cosmic nightmare until its massive form collapsed inward, reduced instantly to a massive, smoking pile of black, putrid sludge. The shockwave was so immense that it blew the sealed heavy doors of the simulation room right off their massive steel hinges, sending them crashing down the outer hallways of the academy. Miles above the carnage, the main surveillance feeds of the academy violently flickered back to life, breaking through the static of the abyssal interference. The Council of Three stood completely paralyzed behind their shattered observation windows, staring at the main holographic display in absolute, dead silence. The apocalyptic threat that had effortlessly breached their impenetrable orbital fortress was entirely gone, replaced by a puddle of decaying quantum ash. In the dead center of the devastated smoking room, standing amidst the ruins and the terrified, trembling bodies of her alien squad mates, stood the human. She was completely coated in corrosive black abyssal fluid and her own crimson blood. Calmly, with an expression of mild, everyday annoyance, Emmanuel reached her single functioning hand to her side, gripped her own ribcage, and violently popped a dislocated bone back into its proper place. The spatial lock that the cosmic parasite had placed over the simulation chamber finally shattered. It broke with a sound like a massive pane of ice giving way to a warm current. Heavy extraction teams, composed of the most elite Vanguard assault units, immediately breached the ruin threshold. They raised their plasma rifles, sweeping their targeting lasers through the thick, settling quantum dust. They expected to find a slaughterhouse. They expected to find the broken corpses of 4 cadets. Instead, the Vanguard assault units slowly lowered their weapons in absolute disbelief. The 3 alien cadets were heavily wounded, their bodies battered by the sheer ambient pressure of the entity. Yet they were alive. Slowly, fighting through the agonizing pain of shattered biologies and fried nervous systems, they pushed themselves up from the blood-stained floor. The Drogor, ignoring the horrific fractures in its massive legs, shifted its immense weight, and lowered itself down to one knee. The fragile sylph, its crystalline lattices cracked and weeping bioluminescent fluid, gracefully bowed its head and knelt beside the giant. Finally, the ethereal, its luminous energy body flickering weakly, descended to hover just inches above the deck in a posture of total submission. They did not kneel out of terror. They knelt in absolute, unwavering reverence for the tiny organic creature who had just ripped a god apart to serve as their physical shield. The heavy footfalls of the Supreme Director echoed through the devastated hall. The ancient, towering entity, the absolute authority of the Vanguard Academy, stepped over the melted blast doors. He bypassed the medical teams and walked directly toward the center of the room. He looked down at the smoking, putrid ash of the abyssal entity. Then, he looked at Emmanuel. She was leaning heavily against a shattered bulkhead, her breathing ragged, her uniform soaked in her own blood. Yet her posture remained terrifyingly proud. The ancient director trembled. For the first time in 10,000 years, his voice shook as he addressed a mortal cadet. "Why?" the director whispered, the question carrying the weight of a completely bewildered galaxy. "Why does your species force itself into such a brutal, self-destructive method of conditioning? You mutilate your own flesh. You break your own minds. What incomprehensible nightmare are you possibly preparing to fight in the dark?" Emmanuel slowly lifted her head. She looked directly into the ancient eyes of the director. The feral, predatory fire that had burned during chaos release had faded, replaced by a profound, weary calmness. Her words, however, remained as sharp as a newly forged blade. "We are not preparing to face a nightmare, Director," Emmanuel replied softly, her voice echoing clearly in the silent, ruined hall. "This universe is far too harsh. It is cold, unforgiving, and overflowing with cosmic horrors. Therefore, hundreds of thousands of years ago, humanity made a choice. We evolved by turning ourselves into the greatest nightmare in the dark, ensuring that no cosmic force would ever dare to threaten the survival of our species." With her single, unbroken hand, she gestured toward the rusted deck where her shattered biosuppressor pins lay scattered among the ashes. "The reason we demand to train alone is not because we are arrogant," she continued, taking a slow, painful breath. "We do not isolate ourselves because we fear that lesser species will get in our way. Our training is not about learning how to fight. Our training is the agonizing process of safely unleashing that destructive, primal ego. It is a controlled detonation of our own monstrous nature. If there is anyone else in the room with us, the sheer kinetic radiation of our will and our unrestrained strength will simply kill them by accident." Emmanuel pushed herself off the bulkhead, standing fully upright despite her horrific injuries. She locked eyes with the Vanguard assault units, the kneeling cadets, and finally, the Supreme Director himself. "We train alone," Emmanuel stated, delivering the absolute, undeniable truth of humanity. "We endure the absolute isolation and the agonizing pain of the suppressors, purely to protect all of you from us." That single, resounding truth rippled outward from the ruined simulation chamber, permanently altering the geopolitical landscape of the entire galaxy. The universe finally understood the human condition. Emmanuel Bunch was immediately decorated and universally recognized by a new, terrifying title: the Abyssal Gatekeeper. From that day forward, no alien species ever again demanded that a human participate in synchronized group conditioning. Humanity was granted the absolute right to continue their brutal refinement in the solitary darkness. However, the perception had fundamentally shifted. Now, whenever the heavy steel doors of a human training vault seal shut and the red warning lights begin to flash, the rest of the universe does not look upon them with disdain. Instead, the cosmic races bow their heads in ultimate gratitude and absolute awe. Every sentient being in the Alliance now understands one undeniable fact. The most dangerous, violent force in the known universe is intentionally chaining itself down to the floor, enduring eternal torment, specifically to protect those they have chosen to call their allies. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for listening to our story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and want to help us out, please consider supporting the channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code right here on the screen, or by using the PayPal link located in the video description or the pinned comment. That $1 gives us the budget to pay our hardworking team, helping them provide for their families so they can continue creating the best science fiction stories to serve you, our amazing audience. Stay safe and see you in the next adventure.